The Quiet Storm. Fair Haven, a picturesque neighborhood in a bustling American city, was alive with the sights and sounds of the holiday season. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine from freshly cut Christmas trees lining the streets. Stores displayed shimmering decorations, and cheerful melodies poured from speakers, painting a picture of festive harmony. Children darted between shoppers, their laughter blending seamlessly with the hum of holiday preparations. Grace Johnson, a woman in her early 30s, walked along the busy street with her son Peter, a bright-eyed 13-year-old with a curious mind. Grace was not one to seek attention, but those who knew her admired her strength and kindness. She worked long hours as a waitress at a small diner, often coming home exhausted, but always with a warm smile for Peter. Life hadn't been easy for her, especially after her divorce, but she had built a stable, loving home despite the odds. Peter, her pride and joy, shared his mother's quiet resilience. He excelled in school and was fascinated by science, spending hours sketching inventions in his notebook. Grace often marveled at how he could see the world not for what it was but for what it could be. As they strolled through the neighborhood, Peter's eyes lit up at the sight of a toy drone in a store window. He pressed his nose against the glass, staring at it in awe. "Someday, Mom," he said with a grin, "I'm going to build one of those. Maybe even better." Grace smiled, ruffling his hair. "I don't doubt it, kiddo. With your imagination, you'll make something the world's never seen before." Their bond was palpable, a partnership forged through love, sacrifice, and shared dreams. But that day, the idyllic scene was about to shatter. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the city. Grace and Peter were heading home, their shopping bags filled with groceries and a few modest Christmas decorations. They turned down a quieter street to take a shortcut to their apartment, a path they'd walked countless times. The alley was narrow but well lit, with murals on the walls depicting unity and progress. As they neared the end of the alley, the sound of a police siren pierced the air, followed by the screech of tires. A squad car swerved onto the street and came to an abrupt stop. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern. One was a younger man with a calm demeanor, while the other, Officer Brad Taylor, was an older, burly man known for his short temper. Grace instinctively pulled Peter closer, her heart pounding. She couldn't think of any reason they would be stopped. They had done nothing wrong. Yet, as a black woman in America, she had learned that reason often didn't matter. "Ma'am," Taylor barked, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Stop right there." Grace complied, her voice steady but laced with caution. "Is there a problem, officer?" The younger officer, whose name tag read Officer Reed, glanced at Taylor before speaking. "We received a report of suspicious activity in the area. Can we see some identification?" Grace handed over her ID, her hands trembling slightly. Peter stood behind her, clutching her arm. The tension in the air was palpable. Taylor scrutinized the ID, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing out here?" Grace frowned, her voice firm but respectful. "We're just heading home. We live a few blocks away." Peter, sensing his mother's unease, spoke up. "We didn't do anything wrong." Taylor's gaze shifted to Peter, his expression hardening. "Stay out of this, kid." Reed stepped forward, his tone conciliatory. "Ma'am, we're just following up on a call. You're not in trouble. If you could just—" Before he could finish, Taylor interrupted. "You people always think you can get away with anything." The words hit Grace like a slap. She felt a surge of anger, but kept it in check. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. Taylor stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "Don't play innocent with me." Grace took a deep breath, her mind racing. "Officer, we haven't done anything. You can check our bags if you want. We're just trying to get home." Taylor reached for one of the bags, yanking it out of Grace's hand. Groceries spilled onto the pavement, and Peter gasped. Grace bent down to gather them, but Taylor grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. Peter's voice cracked with fear. "Let her go." Taylor sneered. "Maybe you should teach your kids some respect." Grace wrenched her arm free, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. "You have no right to treat us like this." The situation escalated in an instant. Taylor shoved Grace back, and she stumbled, falling against the wall. Peter screamed, rushing to her side. Reed tried to intervene, but Taylor brushed him off. "That's enough," Reed finally shouted, stepping between Taylor and Grace. Grace stood, her heart pounding. Her instincts screamed to get Peter out of there, but she knew they were trapped. She met Taylor's glare with unwavering defiance, refusing to let him see her fear. "Let's go," Reed said firmly, pulling Taylor back toward the squad car. "We've wasted enough time here." Taylor hesitated, his jaw tight, before finally relenting. As they drove away, Grace and Peter were left standing in the alley, shaken but unbroken. That night, as they sat at their small kitchen table, Peter spoke softly, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm sorry, Mom. I shouldn't have said anything." Grace reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You have nothing to apologize for. You stood up for what's right. Never let anyone make you feel wrong for that." Peter nodded, his eyes filled with determination. Grace could see the fire in him, the same fire she had carried all her life. She knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. As they prepared for bed, Grace made a silent promise to herself and her son. They would not be silenced, and they would not be broken. What had happened in that alley would not define them. It would propel them forward into a fight for justice they had never imagined. The breaking point. The night after the altercation with Officer Taylor, Grace lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling of her small apartment. The room was silent except for the faint hum of a heater struggling against the winter cold. Beside her, Peter had curled up in his blanket, his breathing steady but tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. She knew he wasn't asleep. How could he be? She turned onto her side and whispered, "You okay, sweetheart?" Peter hesitated before mumbling, "I hate him." Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. She had spent her life teaching Peter about resilience, about the power of kindness. But how could she ask him to be kind in a world that had just tried to break them? "You don't have to hate him, baby," she said softly. "But you do have to fight back, just not with anger." Peter turned his face into the pillow. "Then how?" Grace had no answer. The next morning, Grace woke up exhausted. Her body ached, not just from fatigue, but from the invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, packing Peter's lunch, dressing for work, and making coffee she didn't have the appetite to drink. Peter sat at the tiny kitchen table, picking at his toast. His usual bright demeanor was dimmed, his mind still stuck in the alleyway confrontation. "I can stay home today," Grace offered, brushing a hand over his hair. Peter shook his head. "No, I'll be fine." Grace studied him, searching for any cracks in his resolve. But Peter was like her. He hid his pain well. As he grabbed his backpack and headed for the door, he paused. "Are you going to do something about what happened?" Grace's stomach twisted. She wanted to. She wanted to scream, to fight, to demand justice. But where would it get her? Who would listen? "I'll figure it out," she said. Peter nodded but didn't look convinced. And for the first time in a long time, Grace wasn't sure if she was, either. The weight of silence. Grace's shift at the diner felt longer than usual. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of customers, and the smell of frying bacon all blended into a mindless blur. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Peter's question. Was she going to do something? She had seen what happened to people who stood up to the system. Their stories were plastered across the news. Families torn apart, people who had lost jobs, homes, their very freedom. And yet, doing nothing felt just as unbearable. As she refilled a cup of coffee for an older woman sitting at the counter, the diner's TV flickered to a news segment. The words hit Grace like a punch to the gut. Police officer under SCUTI For XCESSIV4C against local woman and child. She nearly dropped the coffee pot. The screen showed grainy cell phone footage. It had been taken from a distance, but it was unmistakable. It was them. The moment Officer Taylor shoved her against the wall, Peter's frightened scream cutting through the night. Grace felt her knees go weak. Someone had seen. Someone had recorded it. And now the world knew. Fire and fury. By the time Grace got home, reporters were swarming her apartment building. Cameras flashed as she stepped out of her car, microphones shoved toward her face. "Ms. Johnson, do you have a statement? Are you pressing charges? What do you want to say to Officer Taylor?" She stood frozen, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight, knowing that being too loud, too visible, could get people like her hurt. But Peter was watching from their apartment window, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. Grace lifted her chin and spoke. "I want justice." The aftermath. The news spread like wildfire. Social media erupted in outrage, and community activists rallied around Grace and Peter. People they had never met showed up at their door, offering support, resources, even legal help. For the first time in her life, Grace felt like she wasn't alone. But with the support came the threats. A brick was thrown through their apartment window one night. The word LIAR was scrawled across their door in red paint. The police department released a statement claiming that the officers were simply responding to a call and that no excessive force had been used. Grace read the statement over and over again, her blood boiling. They were calling her a liar. They were calling Peter a liar. And she refused to let them get away with it. The breaking point. One evening, as Grace and Peter sat on the couch watching the news, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Officer Reed standing there. Her body tensed. "What do you want?" Reed hesitated before speaking. "I want to help." Grace's eyes narrowed. "Help." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "What Taylor did was wrong. I tried to stop him, but I wasn't strong enough." Grace crossed her arms. "So now you grow a conscience." Reed swallowed hard. "I know I should have done more that night, but I want to do more now. I have body cam footage, real footage, not the edited version they released." Grace's breath caught. This was it. The truth. The evidence they needed. Peter stepped beside her, his young face hard with determination. "Then let's use it." Reed nodded. "I'll testify. I'll say what really happened." Grace studied him, searching for any sign of deception, but all she saw was guilt. And maybe, just maybe, the chance for something bigger than revenge. The chance for change. The fight begins. The lawsuit was filed the next day. Grace knew it wouldn't be easy. The system was built to protect men like Taylor, to silence people like her. But she had Peter. She had the community. And now, she had the truth. As she walked into the courthouse, the weight of centuries of oppression on her back, she whispered the same words she had told Peter that night. "You don't have to hate them, but you do have to fight back." And this time, she was ready. The fire of truth. The cold air outside the courthouse was thick with tension. News vans lined the street, their antennas reaching skyward like mechanical arms grasping for a signal. Protesters gathered at the steps, some holding signs that read "Justice for Grace and Peter," while others shouted for the immediate resignation of Officer Taylor. A few counter-protesters lingered in the background, their faces twisted with anger, their signs defending the police. Grace Johnson took a deep breath, adjusting the scarf around her neck. She wasn't used to this. The cameras, the flashing lights, the eyes of the world dissecting every step she took. She had never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted to be the face of a movement. But she had no choice. Peter gripped her hand tightly, his fingers cold despite the gloves he wore. His face was determined, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Grace squeezed his hand, reassuring him that they would face this together. "This is just the beginning, Mom," Peter whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I know, baby, she whispered back. "But we're ready." The courthouse doors loomed before them. Inside, the battle for truth was about to begin. The trial begins. The courtroom was smaller than Grace had imagined, but its gravity was immense. Every seat was filled, reporters scribbling notes, community members watching intently. At the front, the judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a firm mouth, called for order. Officer Taylor sat at the defense table, his expression impassive. He was flanked by a team of well-dressed lawyers, each one flipping through documents, ready to twist the truth into something unrecognizable. Grace and Peter sat with their attorney, Marcus Lane, a well-respected civil rights lawyer who had taken on their case pro bono. He was sharp, calculating, and most importantly, fearless. "Ms. Johnson," he whispered, leaning toward her, "no matter what they say today, remember this: you hold the truth. Don't let them shake you." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The trial began with the prosecution presenting their case. Footage from that night played on the courtroom screen, the grainy, shaky video that had gone viral. The audience gasped as Taylor was seen shoving Grace against the wall, as Peter's terrified scream echoed through the alley. Then came the body cam footage. Officer Reed had provided the unedited version, and it was damning. Unlike the department-issued clip that conveniently cut off, this footage showed everything: the aggression in Taylor's voice, the way he grabbed Grace without provocation, the moment he shoved her so hard she nearly hit the ground. The courtroom was silent when the clip ended. Grace glanced at Taylor. For the first time, his impassive mask cracked. He looked nervous. Good. The web of lies. Taylor's defense team wasted no time trying to discredit Grace. "Ms. Johnson," one of the lawyers began, standing with practiced ease, "you claim Officer Taylor attacked you unprovoked. Yet, according to the police report, he was responding to a call about a possible suspect matching your description." Grace clenched her fists. "That's a lie. We were just walking home." The lawyer smirked. "And yet you refused to comply immediately when asked for identification. Were you perhaps hostile?" Grace's jaw tightened. "I was confused. He didn't explain why we were being stopped." The lawyer paced. "And your son, he became agitated, did he not?" Grace glanced at Peter, who sat stiffly in his seat. He was scared. Any child would be. "But he yelled at an officer, didn't he?" Grace's anger flared. "He told him to let me go." "So you admit your son escalated the situation?" Grace took a deep breath. She knew what they were doing. Twisting words. Painting Peter as aggressive. She wouldn't let them. "My son defended me when a grown man twice my size put his hands on me," she said, her voice strong. "If that's escalating, then yes, he did." The lawyer faltered for a moment before moving on. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The turning point. When Officer Reed took the stand, the tension in the courtroom thickened. He shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face was pale, and his voice, though steady, carried the weight of guilt. "Officer Reed," Marcus Lane said, stepping forward, "can you confirm the footage we just watched is authentic?" Reed nodded. "Yes." "You were there that night?" "Yes." "Did Ms. Johnson or her son do anything that warranted Officer Taylor's use of force?" Reed hesitated, and then he exhaled, the truth finally escaping. "No." Murmurs erupted in the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel for order. Marcus continued, pressing forward. "So why did Taylor push Ms. Johnson?" Reed swallowed hard. He thought she was being disrespectful. Grace's stomach twisted. Disrespectful. Not dangerous. Not threatening. Just not submissive enough. Marcus nodded. "And what happened after?" Reed looked at Taylor, his expression unreadable. "I tried to stop him, but I didn't do enough." A heavy silence fell over the room. Reed's words were more powerful than any piece of evidence. He was one of them, and even he admitted Taylor was wrong. The verdict. The trial lasted for days. Grace barely slept, anxiety eating away at her, but she kept pushing forward. For Peter, for herself, for every person who had been silenced before her. When the jury finally returned, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The judge read the verdict aloud. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, tears, shouts of anger from Taylor's supporters. Grace barely heard any of it. She turned to Peter, pulling him into her arms, feeling the weight of years of injustice finally begin to lift. It wasn't just about Taylor. It was about a system that had let people like him thrive. And this was just the beginning. The aftermath. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Taylor was sentenced, not as harshly as he should have been, but enough to set a precedent. The police department launched an internal review, and new policies were put in place. Protests turned into conversations. Conversations turned into actions. And Grace. She was no longer just a mother trying to survive. She was an activist, a voice for change. And as she stood before a crowd at a rally a month later, Peter by her side, she spoke the words that had carried them through. We don't fight with hate. We fight with truth. And for the first time, in a long time, she believed that truth could win. The cost of truth. The echoes of the courthouse verdict had not yet faded when the real battle began. For some, justice was served with the conviction of Officer Taylor. For others, it was just the first domino to fall in a fight that had existed long before Grace Johnson's name was known. The city of Fairhaven was now a battleground, not of weapons, but of ideology. Some called her a hero, a mother who had fought back against systemic injustice. Others called her a liar, a woman who had ruined a good cop's career. But what hurt most were the threats. They came in the form of letters slipped under her apartment door, emails filled with slurs, and shadowy figures lingering too long outside her home. Peter, once a carefree boy who dreamed of building drones and changing the world, had become cautious, constantly looking over his shoulder. It was clear. The world did not forgive those who disrupted its balance. The price of speaking up. One evening, as Grace walked home from a community meeting, she noticed a black SUV idling near her building. It was the third time she had seen the same vehicle in a week. She quickened her pace, her pulse accelerating. When she reached her door, she fumbled with her keys, stealing one last glance over her shoulder. The SUV was gone. But the fear remained. Inside, Peter was hunched over his homework at the kitchen table. He looked up when she entered, his expression expectant. "Did you talk to them?" he asked. Grace set down her purse and exhaled. "Yeah. The community group is organizing another rally. They want me to speak again." Peter nodded, but his enthusiasm was dulled. "You sure that's safe?" Grace crouched beside him. "Baby, this is bigger than us. If we stay silent, we let them win." Peter clenched his fists. "I just don't want anything to happen to you." Grace stroked his cheek. "Nothing will. I promise." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they might be a lie. The thin blue line. It wasn't just the threats that unnerved her. It was the silence. Officer Reed had become a pariah within the police force for testifying against Taylor. His fellow officers no longer spoke to him, and his superiors had reassigned him to desk duty. Though he had done the right thing, he was paying for it in isolation. One evening, Grace received a call from an unknown number. "Hello. It's Reed." Grace straightened. "What's wrong?" A long sigh. "I don't have long. I need you to know something." Taylor wasn't acting alone that night. A chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that call. The one that supposedly led us to you. It was fake." Grace gripped the phone. "Someone set us up." "More than that. There are people in the department who didn't like what happened with Taylor. They think you embarrassed them. They want to make sure you don't do it again." Grace felt her legs weaken. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I should have done more that night, and I won't make the same mistake again." The line went dead. Grace stood frozen, the weight of his words settling in her chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The shadow war. The next few weeks were a blur of rallies, interviews, and sleepless nights. One morning, as Grace left her apartment, she noticed something strange. The tires of her car had been slashed. A single note was tucked under the windshield wiper. Tiropi the TASC, or Illis. She felt a cold fury rise within her. She had fought too hard to back down now. When she arrived at the community center for a meeting, she pulled Marcus Lane aside. "They're trying to scare me," she said, handing him the note. Marcus studied it, his face darkening. "This isn't just intimidation. This is a message." Grace folded her arms. "What do we do?" Marcus exhaled. "We push harder. We file a civil lawsuit against the department. If there are others involved, we expose them." Grace hesitated. "And what if that makes things worse?" Marcus met her gaze. "They already took your peace. Don't let them take your courage too." A new battle. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Fairhaven. For the first time, the city was forced to confront an ugly truth, that Taylor was not just a rogue officer, but part of a culture that had enabled him. Other victims began stepping forward, sharing their own encounters with police brutality. The department responded by going on the defensive. Statements were issued, denying any wrongdoing. Officers who had once smiled at Grace when she passed them on the street now glared at her with open hostility. Then, one night, everything changed. The fire. It was past midnight when the smell of smoke woke Grace. She sat up, her mind foggy, until she heard Peter coughing in the next room. Then she saw it, the thick, black smoke curling under the door. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Peter!" she screamed, rushing to his room. He was already on his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom!" The fire escape. Flames licked at the walls of their living room, blocking the front door. Grace grabbed Peter's hand and ran toward the window. She shoved it open, coughing as smoke burned her throat. "Go!" she shouted, pushing him onto the fire escape. Peter hesitated. "Mom." "Go." Peter climbed down first, Grace following right behind. Below them, sirens wailed as fire trucks approached. By the time they reached the street, their apartment was engulfed in flames. And Grace knew. This wasn't an accident. Rebuilding from ashes. The fire was ruled inconclusive, but Grace knew the truth. Someone had wanted to silence her, to erase her story from existence. They had failed. With nowhere to go, Grace and Peter moved into a safe house provided by community activists. Donations poured in from people across the country who had heard her story. But it wasn't about money. It was about something far greater. Justice. Hope. Change. As she stood before the crowd at the next rally, Peter beside her, she looked out at the sea of faces. Black, white, young, old. People who believed in her. People who were ready to fight. She took a deep breath, the words forming before she even realized she was speaking. "They tried to silence us. They tried to break us. But we are still here. And we are not done." The crowd erupted in cheers, fists raised high. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a movement, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The war for justice. The fire had taken everything. Their home, their possessions, their sense of safety. But it had also ignited something unbreakable within Grace and Peter. They had been backed into a corner, their lives nearly destroyed by the very people sworn to protect them. But they were still here. And they were done being afraid. The aftermath of flames. The morning after the fire, Grace stood among the ashes of what had once been their apartment. The building was still standing, but everything inside was gone. Burned, blackened, erased. Peter stood beside her, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was stony, but Grace knew him too well. He was hurting. "Mom, they did this," he whispered. She nodded. "I know, baby." Peter turned to her, his eyes burning with a determination far beyond his 13 years. "Then we make them pay." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will, but we do it the right way." He exhaled sharply, his fists clenched. What if the right way isn't enough? Grace didn't have an answer for that. The community rises. News of the fire spread like wildfire. The media latched onto it, turning Grace into more than just a woman fighting for justice. She was now a symbol. People rallied behind her. Donations flooded in. Activists, civil rights leaders, and even celebrities began amplifying her story. But not everyone was on her side. Hate messages doubled. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Whispered threats in grocery store aisles. The police department released a vague statement condemning all forms of violence, but they refused to acknowledge the possibility that one of their own was responsible. And then, Officer Taylor's supporters started pushing back. The backlash. It started with protests outside the police department. Men and women in blue stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces set in grim determination, holding signs that read, "Support LUROFFI ERAS. Testu OPTA war on Police." Gracie Johnson is ALIAR. The narrative was shifting. Some in the media began painting Grace as an opportunist, accusing her of using the lawsuit for personal gain. Commentators debated whether she had provoked the situation in the alley. Her character was scrutinized, her past dissected. A mugshot from her teenage years. An arrest for a protest she had attended at 17, surfaced online, used to smear her credibility. Grace was watching the news in the safe house when she saw it. "She has a history of resisting authority," one pundit said. Maybe this was always about attention. Peter threw the remote across the room. How can they lie like that? Grace closed her eyes. She had expected this, but expecting it didn't make it easier. "They're scared," she murmured. Peter scowled. Good. A dangerous ally. A week after the fire, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Lane, her attorney, was at her side when a young woman walked into the safe house's temporary office. She was tall, sharp-featured, with piercing eyes that didn't seem to blink enough. She wore a leather jacket and moved like someone who was always ready for a fight. "Grace Johnson," the woman said, her voice low and intense. "I'm Angela Parks. I work with an organization that handles cases like yours." Grace frowned. "What kind of organization?" Angela smirked. "The kind that doesn't wait for the system to fix itself." Marcus cleared his throat. "I know who you are," he said cautiously. "You and your people have a reputation for aggressive tactics." Angela shrugged. "The system is broken. You know it. I know it. The question is, how far are you willing to go?" Grace studied her. She had heard of groups like Angela's, civil rights organizations that operated outside the law, exposing corrupt cops, leaking documents, even orchestrating public confrontations. "We do things your lawyer won't," Angela continued. "We have people inside the department, people who can find out who ordered that fire." Grace's breath hitched. "You know who did it?" Angela nodded. "Not yet, but we can." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. This is dangerous territory. Grace met Angela's gaze. "What do you want from me?" Angela smiled. "Just a little trust." Secrets in the dark. The next night, Grace received a text from an unknown number. "Meet Unity at Lincoln Park. Midnight. Come alone." She hesitated. It could be a trap. But if Angela really had information, Grace couldn't afford to ignore it.